for punk.
Yeah.
Because they could never kind of like hope to. And as well, the whole thing with these record labels, they were do it yourself. They were kind of, it wasn't, people weren't taking on for like, oh, we'll make money off them. It was people trying to look out for each other and support each other. It was like a very punk thing, and they were all kind of like up in it together. But as well, they had it's Gurwitz, kind of like they missed out thing and the whole thing with them. But like NoFX were doing really, really well. And then Fat Mike went off and set up his own record label, Fat Records, which would be kind of like, I suppose, famous for like Lagwagon. They probably would have been Propagandy as well. The band that don't get mentioned enough. They're an amazing fucking punk rock band as well. They're still good. They're like amazing, very, very intelligent. But a lot of the bands that would have been on Fat Records sound very similar to NoFX, which they kind of should anyway, because it's the same with like on like Epitaph. A lot of them sound like Bad Religion.
Picking stuff that sounds kind of similar to their own style. Yeah.
But a lot of those as well from Epitaph Records ended up going on. I think it was Warner Brothers, some of the bigger ones at the time as well, because they started getting like more of a distribution from it. So with Bad Religion, you would have had their album Stranger Than Fiction at the time, which would have like exploded as well around kind of like the whole Green Day thing. But in the background, then you had The Offspring were kind of slowly coming up. The Egg Night was their first album, which did fairly well on kind of like Epitaph, but then Smash was the one that it fucking
smashed.
It started getting airplay on MTV, and it was just it exploded to the thing where I think it actually outsold Ducky.
Did it?
Yeah, for as far as I know. And then kind of like later on, kind of like Dexter Holland, they would have went on and formed their own record label called Ignite, I think it is. But yeah, in the 90s, it would have been, I suppose, the birth of power. Well, birth, kind of like, you know, when it kind of like hit a peak with kind of like Green Day and fucking
Blink 182.
No, Blink 182 would have came later then, kind of like in the late 90s.
I suppose. When did they start then?
They were going at around the same time, but like the whole thing, it was, they were very, very, very different, I suppose, from they didn't come up with those in the scene. They were kind of like came along. They were inspired by some of those, and they ended up like they were inspired by all the other bands as well, obviously. But yeah, then they came along, but then it was like the late 90s where kind of like it was on the wave of all this pop punk and kind of like doing well, whereas after being MTV-ified, and I think that's where you had a lot of like Sum 41, Blink 182. Good Charlotte, which we'll end up reviewing kind of like near the end of it, but like, I mean, you had a lot, I suppose to a certain point, manufactured bands or bands that were kind of like jumping on the band, you know, they weren't really, it started getting diluted down. And what was the thing is when nearly any fucking comedy movie you put on, there was like punk pop music in it. It was like dominating the stuff. And then I suppose like in the 2000s, that's when it all started kind of like dying off, where you had I suppose like the Fall Out Boy, which they're kind of like they're big, but they're so diluted down from the rest of the thing that they're.
Could you
they're not
consider
really
them
like,
punk?
It's like with a rock band. Like, I mean, not saying that they're bad bands, but they're not. It just the market became oversaturated, I suppose, and there's too many people. It became a formula with stuff. And like it's still going now. Like, with it bands like the Wonder Years, A Day to Remember. Who I love. I think they're great, but I don't even consider them really punk. But even though they have like punk sensibilities to them, some of the stuff that they fucking like hardcore metal band at times.
Melodic metal, I think.
Yeah. So it's it's pretty much kind of like a brief history.
Yes.
A brief rundown of punk pop. So it's supposed to summarize the 70s. You had like the Ramones. Then you had fucking kind of like the Buzzcocks, and
I suppose you had like the Jam and all that kind
the
of
Jam,
stuff as well,
and then kind of like in the mid 80s was a bit of a kind of weird, shitty time for Descendants was one of the standout ones, but it was being dominated by a hardcore scene. Then late 80s up to 94, you had like the birth of bands like NoFX, Green Day. I forgot about Rancid as well. Rancid would have been very, very big because Operation Ivy was a band that they formed. Then they ended up forming Rancid afterwards, which kind of came up in popularity, I suppose, after Green Day and all those, but it was around the same time. But they would have influenced a lot. Like Green Day still play an Operation Ivy cover live a lot of the time, but they would have been massive in it, because I think Tim Armstrong was the singer and guitar player on Rancid. He was a frontman on Operation Ivy as well, and he was very much into the punk scene. The punky, he used to like sweep up at Gilman Street and kind of like, you know, he was very much a central figure kind of in it, you know. So then after that, then briefly again in the 90s, it was like Blink-182 and all those, and then descended into kind of like crap like Good Charlotte. So might give you a hint at where we go with the review later on. And yeah, but I suppose we're going to get into recommended albums. Like, Laura, you're not kind of big into it and stuff, so if you were going to recommend, say, for people...
Well, I mean, obviously you're going to go for the obvious choice, aren't you? Dookie. I mean, that's the kind of the golden star one, I suppose, really, that everybody who was into pop punk will probably have knocking around in their album collection at some stage. I don't think I actually knew anyone at that stage who didn't have Dookie, and it didn't matter what kind of music you were into yourself, whether you're like a metalhead, whether you're into like pop chart stuff, whether you're a bit of an indie kid or something like that. When Dookie came out, nearly everyone I knew ended up buying it, and they're like, oh yeah, Green Day's bloody brilliant, isn't it? Didn't matter what kind of genre you're into, everyone had that bloody tape, and at that stage it was cassettes as well. Everyone ended up having it.
You know, like, I mean, it was just fucking astoundingly massive.
It hit so big, and it's one of these things as well that if you put it on now, it just snaps you straight back to like 94 immediately. At whatever age you happen to be at that age, you just snap back into being that teenager or that, I don't know, 20 something, or that kid or whatever that you were in 94 or whatever. But I mean, I think they hit it perfectly at that particular time, as well as insofar as the MTV videos as well. They just managed to hit everything perfectly. It was just this tsunami of sort of everything converging just correctly to make it this fantastic hit that landed correctly. They had Basket Case, which is this absolute neon psychotic sort of video that just seemed to hit right for everybody. I mean, I can remember that getting airplay on like kid shows and stuff like that in Ireland.
It was crazy how much it was getting played over and over. Like, I mean, it's very much, it caught a thing. It had that kind of like, because the thing that Green Day had going for them was they're basically like the punk version of the Beatles.
Yeah. And
that was the thing that pissed off a lot of people that were into punk, because they were like, oh, we hate the Beatles, and it shouldn't be, it should be fast and it should be this, and whereas they kind of like had that.
They had a melodic sensibility. They were likeable enough chaps, but they still had enough rage and speed that they could potentially still be punk without sort of being called out for it, if you know what I mean. So, I mean, that's probably the top pop punk album for me, easily.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the things as well, because Green Day are still going. They're massive. Like, they kind of like transcend, as most bands, when they get like to that level of popular, they transcend kind of like a genre, where they're kind of like, I think a lot of these bands prefer being just called rock bands now, because like fucking they got, the punk scene was so kind of like shitty towards people. When they got successful, it was like, oh, we're like, I mean, people hate NOFX because they're like, so NOFX are the definition of punk rock. They have always done everything themselves from the word get-go.
They arrange their own tours and everything.
They still arrange their own tours, yeah. Like, I mean, they have their own record label, but and everything is done from the, it's not, they never signed to a big record label. They've always avoided it, which I think is, it's crazy when people start fucking slagging them off. Like, for me, NOFX, it'd definitely be
they'd be your one, yeah.
They'd be the one, like, I mean, Punk and Drublic, which has linoleum on it, which linoleum, fucking hell, I can't speak today, linoleum. Linoleum was just so massive. But like, one of my favourite ones, which I think people should listen to, it's got a lot of great songs on it, but no kind of like hits, is Heavy Petting Zoo. I remember when that came out first. It's basically a guy fingering a goat or a sheep on the front of the album.
Nice.
Well, he's shaving it, but it looks like there's something going on. But there's some really, really, really good songs, but they were kind of got shit on for that as well, because people were saying that it's too heavy. Some of the songs on that, it was too metal. But I don't think you can't go wrong with nearly any NOFX album.
Yeah, in fairness.
With it, like, I mean, there's as well, because they have a couple of kind of like best ofs as Green Day and things like that, so if people want to get into those, for then kind of like The Offspring, after like Smash, Without a Shadow of a Doubt, they kind of continue to go on and get really, really, really big, where they had that Why Don't You Get a Job and Pretty Fly for a White Guy. I think it was Americana was the name of that album, which was like fucking massive for him. But that was like that was rock albums. It was very, very different from stuff. But I think Smash is a fucking good punk rock album. Like, I mean, Smash itself is a great song on it as well, which is very much kind of like a punk anthem, but it doesn't really, I don't think it got released as a single. Then you had it was Come Out and Play was a big one for them, and as well Low Self-Esteem, which was slow, very slow for a punk song. And Gotta Get Away From Me, which is fucking heavy. But like the Offspring were fucking great, and they still are great band. Keep going. Then of course Bad Religion, you have Suffer, it'd be kind of like definitely the recommended one. I think, although my favourite is Stranger Than Fiction, it's got 21st Century Boy on it. Infected as well. And then kind of like going on to some of the others, you had like Blink 182, who I think are really, really good. Enemy of the State was their big one.
They're just an enjoyable band as well. Again, they're a bit like sort of Green Day insofar as they have the sort of the speed and the fury, but they're just likable guys. They have that kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek comedic aspect to things as well. They're just sort of, just that punk aspect to it as well, I suppose, where everything is just sort of like a little bit sort of nudge, wink, wink, sort of like let's make fun of things, let's poke fun at certain aspects of society and all the rest, which I think that's the whole thing about punk as well, is like don't take shit too seriously.
No, well, that was the whole thing. Like, I mean, where it started happening in the early 80s, where people started doing kind of like, funny cover versions of songs. They weren't taking it too, which ended up kind of like carrying through. Yeah. The whole way, kind of like, it's kind of like a punk thing. Like there's a Punkorama, I think maybe the albums are called, where they're basically, and the thing, it's like punk does pop. There's like a load of compilation albums of punk bands covering pop songs, and they're all really, really good. Like, I knew a load of lads that were in different punk bands where we grew up, and it was like a thing where a lot of them loved playing the theme tune to Cheers, the punk version of that, or did they maybe try and get like an old, like Stand By Me was one that a lot of bands used to cover for some reason. Probably kind of like just suited the punk.
Just punkify it up.
But it seems to be just a common thing. People go off and just do their own. And then when Britney Spears got big as well, there's people going off doing like Britney Spears cover versions. And with Pennywise is kind of, it's because I listen to Pennywise, but there's, I suppose, the original one, kind of like, for Pennywise, the album, be fairly good. But Land of the Free, I think, is really good. It's got Fuck Authority on it, which I think is a great song. And there's a few other kind of bigger ones on it. There's a documentary about, I can't think of what it's called. I keep trying to get you to look at it. It's like punk rockers who are fathers, and it's them kind of like, their experience of it, and it covers like Pennywise an awful lot, the main lead singer in it, and it's just really, really, really good. But it shows their whole kind of like thing going through. And then I suppose for Propaganda, I think it's Failed Imagineer. It's their newer one. Their newer album is a fantastic album, which I'd highly recommend. And fucking Sum 41, their first album, I think, is a classic. It's got In Too Deep, and what the fuck is the other one? I can't remember. But like those were like in every Tom Green movie, or kind of like any kind of like, kind of like fucking, what was it? American Pie type teenager movie. Yeah. There was a Blink one. I keep saying Blink 182. Sum 41. Album in it, somewhere along the lines. Yeah, I can't really think of any other ones to kind of recommend.
Yeah, I suppose they're all slightly more recent, I suppose, rather than going back through time and all the rest. But I suppose, just take sort of kind of the top tracks from all of the bands that we've mentioned, like Stiff Little Fingers and the Undertones, and even the likes of, I suppose there was a mention for Elvis Costello in one of the documentaries.
Oh, yeah. Keep forgetting about Elvis Costello, yeah.
He's sort of He's not necessarily tongue-in-cheek or anything like that. He's more of a sort of almost a protest singer kind of a thing. He's always commenting on politically charged situations.
This is what happened
with,
because like as kind of like some of the punk bands got more sophisticated around the early 80s, because like the whole thing with punk as well when it started off was like you don't need to know how to play your instrument, you can just play, because a reaction to all these virtuosos where it was seen that like, oh, you have to fucking have like an amazing guitar player, you have to it was the same thing why a lot of people went off like synth music and all that in the 70s, was because you had to be super rich anyway to afford a synth, because people like going on stage with like things that cost 10 grand, that was like beyond. Whereas at least you can get a guitar, a cheap guitar, you just bang it away, you don't have to be like fucking Eric Clapton playing on her, kind of like